I'm saying Power BI users, Power BI organizations. So first of all, maybe a quick kind of survey, and I don't know how many we have online now, but of the room here, everybody using Power BI today in some capacity? Okay, let me ask you another question then. What does anyone have a dedicated SQL capacity, like a premium capacity? Does anybody have a premium capacity in the organization? Okay, and you may or may not know, it's kind of something that's managed behind the scenes. Because we're going to get into as we kind of go through here today in terms of quick agenda. And I guess we're probably already a few minutes behind schedule here, but I've got roughly an hour's worth of content here, and we can stretch that out a little bit. You'll notice kind of towards the end, I've got a few more advanced topics that we may or may not have time for. But please ask questions as we go. Interrupt me. It's a small enough group that we can you can just shoot your hand or just blurt something out for that matter. But we want to go through at a real high level what Fabric is. One of my colleagues, Pierre Lafamboise, was here at this group, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months ago, and did kind of an all-up overview of Fabric, high level, which he kind of surveyed the entire landscape. Today, we're going to focus really just on the Power BI component of and what Fabric means for Power BI specifically. It's, as you'll see here in a moment, it's just one component of Fabric. And so I'm going to at least level set for the people that may not be real aware of kind of what that means at a high level and kind of talk through that. And then we'll talk about, again, kind of drill into the changes for Power BI. There's kind of one kind of big one that we're going to focus on today. It's called direct lake technology, and just taking a look at what that means for your current architecture, how you might be able to take advantage of that moving forward. And then, so then we'll jump into quite a bit of demonstration, and then we're going to circle back towards the end, really in terms of kind of, we'll have kind of the licensing talk, and that kind of flavors a lot of this, but it's maybe think less licensing and more kind of feature functionality at different price points kind of thing, and talk about how that may fit. So, yes.
Make sure. Are you sharing the extended screen?
Oh, is it just, is it messed it up? Let's try this here.
That's just gonna show this part instead.
Does the microphone work? Or?
Yes, it should.
What if we?
Exactly. We've got giveaway items. If we really
Get out of the way.
I did also want to mention in-house Dory, and Dory is sponsoring our meeting room. Which is good to see. They're always going to have the sponsorship of
Let's try this way.
In the windows, if you do your system.
How does that look, everyone? Julie, can you see that? That better? Okay. Apologies. We wanted to clear up the view there for the people online. Okay. So again, we'll kind of wrap up with some licensing stuff and different scenarios there and what that looks like. All right, let's what I do. Okay, so high level goals for the presentation, because again, I want to kind of level set on what we are going to be able to talk about and kind of what I'm going to maybe kind of rush past here. It's the goal here really today is as Power BI organizations or users, what do I need to know about Fabric? How does this affect what I'm doing? You probably noticed some point in the last 4 months or so, 5, 6 months maybe now, that when you logged into the portal for Power BI, the coloring has changed, the logos have changed a little bit. I mean, that's the immediate thing you see. But what are the implications there? And then talk about some, as I said, the licensing. Let's take a look at maybe how you're licensed today, how you're paying for Power BI, and then how that might color your decisions with some of the licensing and pricing options they have for Fabric moving forward. hit on some of the benefits of Power BI, or not Power BI, but for Fabric for Power BI. And I mentioned kind of Direct Lake is kind of the big one. It's a new storage mode that we're gonna focus on and talk about what that means. And then, kind of talk about how that might cause us to structure some of our architectural decisions in terms of how we move data around, how we present it or how we prepare it to be presented for reporting, and how you might be able to streamline that in this Fabric model as well. Again, a few things that we're not going to be able to do is go really deep on Fabric as a whole, because there are, as you'll see here in a moment, a number of different components of Fabric, and we just don't have time to get into all those. But we will talk about them at a real high level, and we can't even get super deep. Now, I've got a few advanced topics that we might be able to touch on related to Direct Lake and the storage mode here towards the end. If we have time for those, that'll be a little bit more of a deep dive. But we are going to get into some demo. We're going to show some code. I'm not going to sit up here and blab about on slides the whole time. But again, if you have questions, we can kind of route it a little bit as the audience desires as well. So with that said, let's get right in and talk about Fabric itself and what it is. And so Fabric is, I like to call it the SaaS application or the Power BI application of the remainder of the Azure, the Microsoft Azure data stack. For people that are coming from a Power BI background, as I kind of alluded to a moment ago, not a lot changes right away, right? Power BI has been a software as a service offering since its inception 6 or 7 years ago now. But a number of these other workloads that you see listed here in the data factories, some of the warehousing stuff, have not been. And so if you think about how you've gone about some of those tasks in Azure in the past, it's been more on a platform model where you stood up your own services, and then you had to have the struggle to try to make them all work together. A few years ago, Microsoft tried to simplify that and brought everything under that Synapse umbrella. Is anybody using Synapse for different pieces? I imagine you guys are some Synapse users here. They brought a lot of those disparate services under that Synapse umbrella, made them easier to kind of commingle and work together. But under the hood, they were still PaaS offerings, and you paid for them that way, right? Data Factory, particularly one where the pricing model is a little nebulous. It's kind of hard to figure out what you're spending on Data Factory a lot of times. You're running big pipelines and consuming resources at that level. So they've taken all those, a lot of those workloads now, and they pulled them under this Fabric umbrella and turned them into a software as a service offering. So it means you're paying a flat rate per month, basically, to be able to use really interchangeably any one of these various workloads to consume that service that you've purchased, or that, and we'll get into the pricing options later. But so again, within one service here, you can run Data Factory pipelines that are going to pull data in from a variety of sources. You've got some of your machine learning and data science workloads. There's some of the real-time analytics that, of course, we're not really going to be able to get into, but it's all under the same umbrella. You're all consuming kind of the same shared resources, and it's all underpinned by the One Lake. And it's maybe it's a branding thing, but the One Lake is still just Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. You guys have probably, those of you who've been using Synapse, have been creating data lakes on your own that use the same technology. But again, here they've roped it into this Fabric model into this software as a service offering, and they've stitched it so that it easily connects to each of these various different offerings, with the goal being that you can simplify the movement of data and create single versions. That's what we've been chasing in the business intelligence world for 20 years, right? The single source of the truth, or longer than that. But save you the need to move data around and create multiple copies of it. And even if you think about what Power BI has been like, over the past few years, right? There's a lot of, if you spin up a model in one workspace, maybe you have some shared dimensions coming from other workspaces. There are ways that we've kind of architected around some of those kind of challenges in Power BI. This one lake, again, tries to pull everything into a shared environment where they can be shared across various work spaces in Power BI and various different workloads across Fabric. So that's kind of the big picture. So again, SaaS foundation, we've got the unified lake, and then by pulling everything into the software as a service model, we've got a more centralized administration and governance kind of model that is still evolving a little bit. We'll talk about some of the security implications of the one lake and how that works. And again, this is very much the Power BI application, kind of this combination low code / pro developer kind of mindset. Whereas we're in like in Power BI, you can get your business analysts that don't have a lot of heavy data experience building reports and being productive in Power BI, and then you still have your the tools are capable enough that your pro developers can kind of get in and roll up their sleeves and really get a lot of cool stuff done behind the scenes. And they're taking that same model and kind of pushing that into maybe some of these others like the data science and data factory kind of workloads as well. So any quick questions about Fabric? Anybody started playing with Fabric a little bit? Maybe, I mean, again, you've probably seen the changes to the Power BI portal, which I guess we're going to call the Fabric portal now. So what does this mean for Power BI right off the top here? So not a lot of immediate like earth-shattering changes, right? You guys have all been in the portal, the Power BI portal recently and seen the cosmetic changes. There's no breaking changes in terms of what you've been doing previously. So everything that's worked previously in old Power BI still works now in Fabric Power BI. The product itself is still kind of baseline, same thing. Now we've seen some new features kind of get rolled out, and I hesitate to even kind of layer these in with Fabric. I don't think that either the GitHub integration or some of the Copilot features that are starting to come online necessarily require the Fabric licensing. They're more like just kind of iterations of the Power BI platform that we've been used to, with those monthly releases for some time. But at least timing wise, they kind of coincide with some of the kind of the conversion here to this Fabric model. The GitHub integrations is interesting. I know that some of the source code management has always been difficult on the Power BI side. Some of the kind of code development workloads and stories have been a little lacking on the Power BI side. So GitHub integration provides some interesting, some kind of much needed solutions there. But what I really want to focus on today is this new storage mode. This is the big ticket item as far as Power BI is concerned that really does require and is lit up when you move to this Fabric model, because it is all underpinned with that and requires that one lake data lake underneath the hood in order to work the way we want. So Direct Lake allows us to, let me back up. Historically speaking, Power BI has had primarily two storage modes when you build a Power BI model. We're calling semantic models now. You've had your import mode, which is the kind of the default and the one that most people go with. That's when you get in fact, let me just move ahead to our slide here that it kind of shows it off. So in the import mode, you're pulling data out of your source, whatever source that is, whether that's a line of business application or a relational data warehouse potentially that you've put together. It pulls that data out of the source. It loads it up into the model that eventually gets published out to the Power BI service and creates a cached store of your data for Power BI to use as people are interfacing with your reports. And that's why when you interact with a Power BI report, it's so fast, right? You click and filter and drill, and those things are all happening sub-second kind of response times because Power BI has got a cache of your data sitting up there. The downside of that, of course, is you have to fill up those models. You have to have those scheduled refreshes that pull new data into that model. Sometimes those can be time consuming. We've worked with a few clients that have Power BI models that run multiple hours, and sometimes it's a challenge to even get those loaded in the kind of window that you have to process those things overnight. So that could be a challenge. And even in best case, the data is stale to some extent, right? Because even if you've got a refresh that happens every 5-10 minutes, it's still not live data. So the other kind of the opposite end of that spectrum is the direct query mode, is the other traditional storage mode that Power BI has made available. And that's, as kind of the name implies, the semantic model just serves as kind of a throughput gate, essentially, for the queries that come from your reports, come through as DAX queries. They go back to your semantic model. Your direct query semantic model then just translates those into, typically like a SQL command. If your underlying source is a SQL command or a SQL database, it converts that to a SQL statement, waits for the results to come back, and then does whatever other transformations and calculated tables and measures, things like that at the semantic model level, and pushes those back out to the report. So you can see that's obviously slow. I don't know if anybody's played with direct query. It's going to be very dependent on the speed of your source systems and the speed of your connection. And so it's been usually relegated to some scenarios where real-time kind of connections are absolutely vital because of the nature of the underlying data. So I would imagine that, probably 90% of people or 85% of people are probably using standard import mode on most of their reports. Direct query, again, kind of a niche thing. So that brings us to Direct Lake. And the promise here is the best of both worlds, that we have the ability now to get import level performance out while also getting direct query kind of real-time feedback from our data, without the need, again, to maybe or without the need to do a big refresh of the data in a cached version that sits out on Power BI's servers. What allows this to happen, what powers this, is the One Lake, and specifically the way that that One Lake really likes to, or at least from a Power BI's perspective, likes to store that data. And Power BI, when you create your One Lake and create, as you'll see here in a moment, either what they're calling a warehouse in Power BI or in Fabric, or a lake house in Fabric, which are kind of two approaches to the same thing. The underlying data itself is stored in a Delta format Parquet file, if anyone's familiar. So Parquet is just a data columnar data store, which and the reason that this is kind of possible is because that columnar data store in Parquet is very similar to the columnar data store that Vertipack engine that Power BI has been built on operates. It's not identical, but they're similar enough that Microsoft was able to kind of adapt the technology to kind of use it here. And so that it uses that Parquet format and the Delta, or the Parquet files for storage, and the Delta format on top of that. These are both open source Apache projects. At least Parquet is Apache. Yeah. Open source projects. Delta just puts a layer on top of your Parquet files that really make them ACID compliant. You can easily do updates, inserts, deletes within a Delta formatted Parquet file, whereas just a Parquet file, you're basically having to rewrite the data every time. So the data store then operates much like your traditional, relational, or not relational, but your traditional SQL database, right? You've got the same kind of capabilities there to be able to update data. So this Direct Lake, as we're going to jump in and show here, really works like the way that the best way I heard it phrased is it's like import mode on demand. And what it allows because the data is stored in that Delta format, what it allows it to do is it, rather than loading your entire data set into memory in Power BI, on a nightly basis, for example, or during that refresh. Power BI is able to be smart enough to just kind of load what it needs based on the context of your report and load that into memory. So it's not, you're not going to get perfect fidelity with performance for import mode. Sometimes if you've got kind of a newer model or one, or you're looking at maybe data that people haven't looked at in a while, or data that may not be already cached up there, you could see a slight delay as Power BI kind of has to go out and read that data from the one lake and kind of pull it up into its memory. But for 9 times out of 10, the performance is going to be very similar to what you're seeing in import mode. So let's jump in and take a look at what this how this is set up, what it looks like in Power BI, and walk through some different scenarios here. Any questions before we go? Yeah, Gary.
So in data stored in Power BI service, it's stored in that VertiPack, very efficient column store. I think it's a column store format. Does Direct Lake, are those files structured in a similar way to provide that sort of performance?
Yeah, that's again. So Parquet being a columnar data store is the mechanics of it under the hood are very similar in terms of the structure of the data. Again, it's not a compatible format per se, but the structure of the data was similar enough that Microsoft was able to essentially kind of adapt their VertiPack engine to run on top of these Parquet or these Delta enabled Parquet files. And in fact, while they are all Delta enabled or Delta formatted Parquet files, Microsoft layers I think what they're calling a V order on top of it. So it's a little bit of kind of their own flavor of Delta Parquet files. That just adds an additional little bit of, it has to do with the way that the data is stored on there. They're still Delta compatible for any other tools. And that's one of the nice things about these open source projects is now you've got your data written in this Delta format. There are a number of other tools that can access it. And we'll talk about the benefits of that here in a bit. But that V order layers on another little kind of extra bit for that only the Microsoft tools can kind of both write and read, that speeds it up a little bit for Power BI as well. So all right. Yeah. I don't know that I've seen any stats, as I was kind of alluding to a moment ago, it all has to do with how much think of it as import mode on demand. So as you load up your dashboard, your report, if you're the first person that loads it up, if I got a new model out there and you're the first one, you might see a small delay as it's kind of pulling that data in that it needs. But again, it's able to be much more targeted because it says, I want to see sales by month and broken down by product group or something like that. And it's getting more of an aggregated view of the data at that point. So it may be a slight, but once that data is brought in, that import on demand is accomplished, then essentially it's operating the same way as it would in import mode anyway. It's already got the data, it's got a cache of its data. It's just managing that a lot more intelligently than the old import mode, which was just give me everything. I want a full set of all your data, and I'm going to pull it into memory and keep it here waiting for you. It's just a little more targeted. So, yeah.
So we have a message online from Ezekiel. Is there an additional analytic language to learn if using a Fabric solution to Power BI? For example, if people are going to use Power BI, it's important to understand Power Query and DAX. Is there a language that's good to know if one's using Fabric?
Yeah, that's a great question. The good news is no, not necessarily. I mean, you can use all of the stuff that the things that you mentioned there before. In fact, we'll show how you can use Power Query really to be your data ingest, kind of your data factory piece of this here in a moment as well. So if you've got a lot of Power Query skills, those are still very much applicable. Your DAX language stuff, all that stuff is still 100% available here as well. In terms of additional languages, I mean, within the context of Fabric, there are some additional, some of those what they're calling personas for maybe for data science or for data engineering. And so you can create notebooks where you can write Python script or interact with Spark, your Spark cluster that way. So there are some maybe additional options, but I would not characterize those as maybe 100% necessary, especially just for your standard. If you're thinking of being a Power BI user, there's nothing new necessarily for you to learn here. And in fact, as I'll show you here in a minute, we're going to spin up a little. I've already got a little warehouse spun up here, but it's just we're going to interact with that warehouse just using its SQL endpoint. So I'm imagining that most people that get into Power BI have some at least basic SQL skills, and those are all applicable here as well. And probably the cleaner and easier way for those kind of people to interact with these Delta formatted Parquet files. So under the hood, they're going to store them that way as Delta files. We'll take a quick peek at them and just see what they look like within the context of a storage container, just to kind of prove that I'm not full of it. But in terms of interacting with it, you don't have to know anything new or different really, or any real specialized skills. So I'm going to try to make that bigger. So that's very small. So what I have here, I've got a few artifacts that we'll talk about here, but I've created a sample warehouse. And so the warehouse I mentioned, we've got really kind of two artifacts here that can both kind of manage and expose these Delta Parquet files and that you've put out in your OneLake. And it really have to do with maybe some of the skilling question that just came up. For those that come from a more SQL-oriented background, like I imagine most of the people participating here today, given the nature of this user group, the data warehouse or the warehouse is probably the way to go, and that gives you kind of your full SQL endpoint. That, in fact, if I click into it here, it's going to look very much like a kind of an online version of Management Studio, right? You've got your schema here. You can do a lot of SQL kind of related things with your data. You have full update, insert, delete capability via the SQL endpoint in a warehouse. So you can add data, as I'll show here. And one of the things we're gonna take a look at, modify the data that's out there, and you're gonna do all that through traditional SQL commands. And the engine takes care of modifying those Parquet files that live out in the data lake. So from this standpoint, it's going to look like a traditional SQL environment or SQL server. The real difference is that behind the scenes, rather than maybe an on-prem SQL server that's going to update the MDF files, the LDF files that kind of underpin the backend, the storage component of a SQL server. In this case, we're updating Parquet files that live out on the data lake. But if you're just looking at it from here, it's hard to tell the difference. This is actually a sample that you can spin up through Power BI. This is using some of their New York CAB data. This is if you've seen some of the demos in this, they have some really big data sets on this. This is a smaller data set, but it's got 2 or 3 million rows and kind of its main trip, kind of that main fact table, that trip fact table that we'll take a look at here in a bit. So we've spun this up. You can easily, create your own table still in here if you want something. And again, this is going to be a very SQL-oriented kind of, there's a basic SQL command to create tables. It's the same kind of SQL command that you'd use anywhere else. There may be a few small differences, but for the most part, you can create tables. Again, you can do all the other SQL-related manipulation of data. You can even come in here and create views and store procedures just like you can in a traditional SQL server. So again, very little in terms of differences here. But let me highlight a few things that are a little different about a warehouse in Fabric. And first of all, we're talking about existing Power BI users and what you need to know. Warehouses aren't by themselves aren't required to continue to use Power BI. You can continue to use Power BI the way you always have. You need a warehouse or a lake house in order to create those Delta formatted Parquet files so that we can enable this or light up this kind of direct lake capability that we're going to show here. So I mentioned the warehouse is what we're looking at right now. The reason you choose lake house is if you wanted your endpoint to be a little bit more to interact with it through things like Python scripts and some of your notebooks, it's a little bit different in terms of the way that it presents the data. But just know that under the hood, they're both writing the same data. They're both writing those Delta enabled. I'm going to repeat myself a lot here, but those Delta formatted Parquet files is still what you're getting at the data lake level. So again, we're focused on the warehouse here today. So within the context, so we kind of see the data up here, but we can flip over here to this model tab down here at the bottom. And now all of a sudden you're in a environment that looks a lot like the model window in Power BI, right? You've got all your tables, you create your relationships by dragging and dropping. I've went ahead and created most of these kind of basic relationships that we see in here, but it's the exact same kind of layout and exact same kind of interface that you would have to work with here. At this point, you're creating or you're modifying what's called essentially the generic or the default semantic model. You can create multiple semantic models on top of and by the way, if you haven't noticed the nomenclature changed, what they used to call a data set in Power BI is now called a semantic model. It's another thing that you may have caught on to. So this is the default semantic model. Again, you can create multiple semantic models on top of this, but you can do, in addition to creating the relationships here, I think we could create, in fact, I wanted to do that here. We can create a new measure. And so I think I was going to create one just called, let's just do a count. But this, somebody's asking about DAX before. I mean, this is just DAX language stuff, right? So this is the same stuff we've always done in DAX. And I'm just going to do a count of, we'll just do count of, oops, date ID. So nothing fancy here, but as you can see, you can create those the way we always have in our Power BI models. Now, one caveat here is what we cannot do that we can do in Power BI is create calculated columns or calculated tables. If you've so we have measures which are kind of evaluated kind of at execution time when people look at a report, and you've got calculated columns or tables that are really more of an ETL thing. Those are things that are generated in your traditional Power BI environment. As you load that data, refresh it, and put it into import mode, it'll maybe tack on a column that merges a few things together. Or in some cases, you can do a whole table that way. Some people do it date dimension kind of that way, for example. But those things, because of the nature of this, and again, think about the way that this is operating. This is refresh mode on demand, and so it doesn't want to have to calculate all those things on demand. It wants to stick with just the measure. So if you need to calculate something like that, the recommendation would be to go back to that and do that at your warehouse level or at that Parquet file level, or kind of structure the data before it gets here. So once we have the this semantic model, again, this kind of comes well, caveat this one more time. The only way to build a direct lake semantic model is through this interface here. You cannot yet, anyway, I've heard they're working on this. You cannot yet create a semantic model using direct lake via Power BI desktop. So again, it has to be done here. I think they may close that gap at some point, but just as an aside, it's easy to see that Microsoft is migrating everything this way. Maybe I'm sure that the desktop tool is not going anywhere anytime soon, but it's not hard to see the writing on the wall that a couple years from now that this will be kind of the first party client for a lot of this stuff, and desktop might be more of a legacy kind of approach to this. And I guess while I'm on that topic, the other thing that seemed pretty clear to me, although you won't get Microsoft to say this just yet, is that this direct lake storage mode that we're talking about now is where a lot of their investment is headed moving forward as well. So where, again, you're not going to see the import mode go away anytime soon, and it'll be supported for many years, I'm sure. I think they're going to push people to this because of the kind of dual benefits that we talked about. They're going to push people into this direct lake mode as much as possible. Just so as you're thinking about maybe projects or ways to architect some of this moving forward, you might want to kind of focus on this for some of those reasons. All right, so we've got a semantic model here that's built, and we'll jump back. And just because I'm scared to do all this truly live, I've built out a dashboard or a report rather, consuming some of this stuff. And again, this is see if we go into edit mode, you can kind of see the data model in here. So these are the tables that we just looked at, right? I mean, just like in Power BI, because the relationships already exist, you get all the cross filter kind of stuff. And, just again, like in Power BI, the performance is almost immediate. You're sitting, as you're filtering and cross drilling and things like that. This is import mode on demand. So in my case, some of this stuff was probably already queued up because I looked at it a little earlier. But even in the, I'm going to show you here in a moment, we're going to add a little more data to this and see how it pops over here right away without the need to do a refresh. But in fact, we should just see if that little trip count. Yeah, so that trip count thing that we just added, or that measure we just added, popped up in here as well. So again, there was no deployment. There was no publish out to the Power BI service after I finished that. There was no refresh of the data model after I did that. It shows up in here almost right away. So I just wanted to show, so let's jump back into the kind of the SQL view of this. Oops. Save those. So this is, I think, as I mentioned, it's New York taxi data. I think the data set ended at the end of 2013. So what I was going to do here is I was just going to copy basically January 1st of 2013 and add it to the end and make it January 1st of 2014, just to simulate adding. And I think this is going to add about 6,000 or 7,000 rows, basically to the next day. And just going to run that. It's going to let it update here in a second. And so it's an insert statement. You can kind of see a little detail here, but what that's doing behind the scenes is it's going back to those Delta files and it's updating them, and we've got new files, new data back there. But from this standpoint, again, it just looks like any other SQL engine. So it's not instantaneous in terms of what you're going to see here in the report, but I think by the time we get over here, and maybe if we refresh a little bit, and this isn't a real-time report necessarily, so it's not trying to refresh, but if you hit this little refresh button up here in the corner, what we should see is an extra, it just popped up pretty quick. So we've got the next day, the January 1st, 2014 that we just added. There was added 6,700 rows. But you can see, again, there's no refresh there. I can click on that, and again, speed is there immediately. There's no drop in performance really to speak of there. And so you can imagine a scenario where that was our ETL process, right? We loaded another day's worth of data into our warehouse, in this case, into that trip table, and immediately then, within seconds, that data is available on our reports for people to consume and see it. The speed is there. There's no refresh of the data model or the data set or the semantic model. At this point, there is no costly, refresh time. Now, that for modeling, this one's still fairly modest in size in terms of the number of rows here. But has anyone done any incremental refresh in Power BI? Has anybody tried that route on larger data sets? A little bit, yeah. I know we've worked with some clients that again have some big Power BI models that the downside of that import mode in Power BI is that it's an all or nothing kind of an approach. If you tell your Power BI model to refresh, by default, it goes out and it refreshes all of its tables. So if you've got 10 years worth of taxi cab trips in a big fact table, and you just wanted to add another day's worth, or maybe a few hours worth for that matter, you've got Power BI has to go refresh and it throws everything away and it pulls an all new copy of your data. that incremental refresh is a bit of a workaround or kind of a cheat to that, where you can tell it to be a little more targeted and say, maybe just go refresh a specific partition. It works pretty well if you can get it set up. It's a little bit of a pain to get kind of configured and to manage it and to initially load all the data. And it's certainly not 100 level stuff, but it works. But you could see an approach where you have those bigger models in a scenario like this, where you're just writing the data out to your warehouse, you're updating those Parquet files that exist that both our warehouse is built on top of, as well as our Power BI semantic model. And in that case, there's no need for a big expensive refresh. The data is immediately available for you, and you can, often go. So any quick questions about what we've seen? There are a few more things here I want to show you related to kind of how we get data into this environment. But any questions about how that direct lake model works?
You said some fundamentals of SQL are available under.
Mhm.
And then I saw a little bit of allusion that transact itself is available.
Yeah.
Any hard limits that aren't real esoteric?
I mean, certainly some of the more advanced things well, first of all, in terms of the administration level, it's not, it's a completely different platform under the hood. So you don't have to worry about all of your indexes and those kind of things that you would typically do in a SQL environment.
So I'd be worried about like how to apply or something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure there are probably some, and the way that Microsoft typically works these things, right? I mean, it's probably 90% compatible, and then I'm sure there's some things that are hanging around. I don't have the list of those, or I haven't run into any, so I think they're fairly obscure still. And I'm sure they're working through it. There are probably still going to be some that are just not going to be compatible at some point. But
strategies, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but all that, the traditional kind of stuff. Now, all that said, now I should put a couple of caveats on this direct mode. So I mentioned that, come back here, that that if we go to the model view, in fact, you saw one here. So these are all tables you see, and that's the little blue dotted line indicates that they're all direct mode enabled. I think that's what that means. But there is a view that they've created in here. So this view payment analysis. Views are not supported in direct mode. So if you bring a view, so you write your view, and you can get pretty complicated with your SQL in your view to join tables together and do a number of things. Looks like this one must do some group by stuff. But if you connected that one through into this model and we queried it, the data is still available, and it would be actually might be an interesting test to see what it did here. But because of the underlying SQL that's contained in that view, direct lake will not work by default. So what will happen, and this is true of maybe your more expensive queries as well. So there are a few scenarios where if you have a direct lake enabled model like we do here, where direct lake will fall back, is what they say, to a direct query mode. And again, in direct query mode, then you're going to have to pay all those penalties that we talked about before, where it's going to have to translate the request and then push it into SQL and then wait for this environment to respond and then kind of push it back up. So it's going to be much slower. A view is one of those things that will break direct lake mode and cause it to fall back to that direct query mode. There are certain DAX commands that could cause that to occur as well, and it has more to do with kind of how expensive those DAX commands can be and how much manipulation of the data they have that could cause it to fall back to direct query mode. And then we'll talk about some of those advanced topics I touched on earlier. They have what are called guardrails around your direct lake connection to make sure that you're not consuming too much in terms of resources when you're running these things. That'll get into kind of our licensing and our scale up kind of discussion that we're going to jump to here in a minute. So we'll circle back to that. But if you exceed certain thresholds, and there's possibility that your reports or your direct query, or sorry, your direct lake mode, like how Microsoft picks like 3 words and they just one everything and there's direct everything and there's power everything. It makes it hard. I lost my train of thought. So there's some guardrails they put there to keep you from consuming too many resources and cause you to fall back. So we'll look at some of those as we kind of wrap up as well. So anyway, what was I going to show you here? We already added the data there. So let's talk about one other way to kind of get data into this model, because I can imagine that you guys are kind of thinking, well, I've got a big data warehouse right now, or none of my data is in this Delta Parquet format, right? So how do I get it there, and what's that going to be like? Because that sounds like a big lift, and it may or may not be, depending on kind of where you've or how you're doing this today. But you can create. So here in the Fabric portal, you hit this new. These are all customized to the persona that you're currently using. The persona is set down here. So since we've got the Power BI persona set. If you guys can see that down in the corner, you're seeing Power BI related icons up here. You can change that to one of these other scenarios. See that down there. You change that to one of the other personas, and you'll see it kind of a different set of objects up there. It's just it just tries to kind of tailor the experience to different personas. But you can always get to the if you just go to the more options here, you'll get to the page that basically shows you everything. And what I wanted to take a quick look at here were these data flow Gen 2 workflows or pipelines or whatever they want to call them. Come on. So this should look immediately familiar to anyone with a Power Query or Power BI background. Eventually, because this is really just Power Query for the web, and I know we've had something similar to that with data flows in Power BI. I don't know anybody using data flows for anything in Power BI. So this is very similar, but this hasn't been real cooperative earlier today. But there's one key difference in these data flows. I give up on this one. There we go. Okay. So again, this is a Power BI or a Power Query interface where you've got all your same kind of get data kind of things here. Different kind of connections. So once you get in, I'll just connect to just kind of a generic. Excel document here real quick, maybe if I can find something. Let's go get some dashboard into day data. How's that sound? But again, very similar in terms of your kind of get data experience here. So all your same kind of connectors should be available. I'm just going to grab a table out of this Excel workbook. I really just want to show, so you've got all your kind of steps. You can do all your different types of transformations and add columns and whatnot. I'm not going to get into all that, but what I do want to show you here is this this bit down here in the corner. And so this is your data destination. So unlike your traditional Power BI data model or your semantic model, where you create, you do all your transformations, you create a table in a Power BI model or a semantic model, and you publish it. It's a little landlocked at that point. There's not much you can do with it outside of Power BI. Power BI, you spend all that work, you put all that time into it, but Power BI is really the only thing that consumes it. In this case, you can still do all your Power Query stuff you've always been able to do, but at the end, rather than just write this into a Power BI semantic model, you've got a few options of where you want to land that data. And particularly, you could take it directly to an existing SQL data warehouse, for example, and do your ETL potentially that way. But if you want to put it into one of these models that we just looked at, like a warehouse or a lakehouse model, you can select that as well. And I got a zoom mode, but we're just gonna connect it to a warehouse. At this point, I think it does lock you into a warehouse that's in your current workspace. we kind of skipped over workspaces, but workspaces are still the kind of the way they've almost always been here in Power BI. You know, we're just going to create it as a new table here in our sample work warehouse that I created. Although you could plug it into one that's already there, and then you've got, you know, you can either just append it to a table if you just want to add new rows every night, or you can just use it to replace that. Some pretty simple questions about, you know, data types. And you say that now every time this little data flow runs, and you schedule these data flows to run very similar to the way you would a Power BI refresh. You have those same kind of options. You tell it how often you want it to run. And when it gets done, again, instead of having a refreshed import mode Power BI model or a semantic model, now you've got a refreshed table in your warehouse. Go ahead and publish that. It'll run out here in the background for a minute.
And you're locked into your workspace, but your other products like connectors and how can, you know, flows have visibility into the Azure locked into workspace.
What other kind of connectors are you talking about?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out if it's technically a Azure SQL Server, but isolated into itself, or if you have others.
Well, I want to be careful because this is not an Azure SQL instance. It's a SQL endpoint. And the difference there is, again, it's that there's not a SQL engine per se running underneath it. There's a SQL endpoint, which is really just kind of a translation layer that allows you to run SQL commands against this Delta Parquet files that exist under the. So in SQL Server, we've been able to do those external table. And have you ever done an external table in SQL Server where you're kind of pointing to? That's one very similar way where, unlike traditional table in SQL Server, you're not actually pulling the data into the SQL engine itself. You're just kind of using SQL as a front end to manage the data that it exists somewhere else.
So my dreams of linked server into that is.
You can link. It has a publicly available endpoint, SQL endpoint. I can, you know, in fact, let's take a look. I can like show you the see a view, you know, copy a SQL connection string. So I could take that and stick that into Management Studio and pull it up, and it would see it, and it would look like a SQL database. And so that's actually one of the points that I wanted to touch on is that one of the really, so you kind of saw it there with that data flow we created. It's going to create that, and it's going to land that data in our warehouse. So it's going to be a new table in our warehouse. The files are going to be, you know, Parquet files that exist in our OneLake. So we've got all kinds of options on how to, from an extensibility standpoint, what to do with that data at that point. We can connect from any other SQL enabled tool and do whatever we want with the data that way, and maybe come up with some interesting integration workflows that would connect to it that way. You've got a whole other world of tools that can connect to these Parquet files, these Delta formatted Parquet files, all kinds of other open source tools that can use that same data as well. So as opposed to where we were with Power BI, where again, you spend all this time and you built this semantic model, and maybe you spent a lot of time in Power Query kind of, you know, transforming the data, getting it to look just the way you wanted to. And then it was kind of locked into Power BI. And at best, you could maybe share some of those with other Power BI data sets and things like that and do some interesting things. But it was very hard, not impossible, but it was hard to get that data out of Power BI without digging into APIs or doing some crazy stuff. But now it's open and extensible, and you can connect to it through SQL. You can connect to it through, you know, a Spark notebook if you want to write some Python code against it. It's very accessible for any number of other outside integrations or tools or other things you want to do with it. I'm still refreshing. Yeah, Julie.
There's a question online, another question from Ezekiel. Will the direct late also need to default to a direct query mode when we're trying to use UDFs in the same way that it does when using a view?
That is good. I don't recall them specifically calling out user-defined functions, but if I had to guess, probably that's going to break it. There are a series of, and I wasn't really going to get into this today. It was even beyond the other kind of advanced things that I had queued up here at the end, but there are some views, like some management views that will allow you to kind of monitor your connections there from the well, just kind of monitor your warehouse to see if the reports are using direct lake or if they're kind of bumping back to direct query. I think more often than not, it's going to be pretty obvious when it bumps back to direct query, but not always, depending on kind of the speed of the query and the complexity there. But there are ways to monitor that, so you can kind of tell if you're seeing that fallback occur to that direct query mode. But my guess is, Ezekiel, if I had a guess, UDFs are probably going to cause some issues with the direct lake mode. Again, the preference here is that you, to the extent you can, it looks like didn't like something about my data flow there. The preference is, to the extent you can, is that you do your data transformations before they land in your warehouse, or at least in the tables in your warehouse that you want to expose to your to Power BI and your semantic model. It could be that you've got a series of stage tables in that same warehouse that, where you land kind of raw data, and then maybe you've got some stored procedures in there that take that data and join it up and do a bunch of stuff, and then land it into more of your traditional, maybe your star schema kind of dimensions and facts. But the hope would be that once you get it, that you can get it to that level, or get the transformations done ahead of time, and then from Power BI standpoint, you're just kind of pointing to those tables and not having to do much else with them, with the exception of maybe adding some of your standard kind of DAX calculations, your counts and your sums, and maybe your time intelligence stuff, your year-to-date, month-to-date kind of stuff. All that DAX kind of related calculations, of course, can still occur, and they don't cause any problems. So yeah, it looks like it didn't like. I wonder if I think I may have already created that table, is why it may have failed, and I'm not going to spend any time on it. But again, that's one way. So if you've got, as I mentioned, if you've got some Power Query or some Power BI data sets or semantic models that you've spent, you've got some fairly advanced Power Query or a bunch of Power Query behind the scenes in some of those models that are manipulating that data and getting it all. Well, let me back up. There are kind of two ways that people traditionally attack Power BI data modeling. Either they will spend the time and effort to have a relational data warehouse or data mart that sits behind a Power BI model, and they'll do all their transformations there. Maybe that they do that in Data Factory or something like that out in Azure. And they do a lot of that work that we just talked about, transform it, get it into a nice clean star schema. They've got facts and dimensions, and it's all built out there in a data warehouse, Azure SQL data warehouse, or even just an Azure SQL database. And then they connect Power BI to it, and it's a pretty straightforward path for Power BI. It just kind of grabs those dimensions and facts. Again, maybe at that point they layer on some of the DAX kind of stuff, but there's not very much transformation of the incoming data when you go that route. The other route is what I like to call kind of a virtual data warehouse, where you're pulling in maybe even just some raw source data, and you're doing all that transformation to produce that star schema model. Again, Power BI really wants a star schema model to operate cleanly and be on its best behavior. So it's best if you can get there one of these two routes. But if you don't build that data mart or data warehouse outside of Power BI, then you build it inside of Power BI. You combine all these sources you get from your source, you transform it and create some dimensions off of it. It's a lot more work in Power Query. It can certainly still be done. And I think there are some benefits for, maybe small organizations certainly to go that route. But if you've got that and you've done all that work in Power Query already, it'd be really easy to take that and basically kind of copy it out here to these data flows, and then basically recreate a lot of your ETL in a data flow. And instead of landing it in a Power BI semantic model like you've done previously, you'd land it out here in a warehouse, and it would create it in the one lake, where you could have all the other advantages that we talked about in terms of extensibility and access for other sources. So that may be one kind of migration path if you're kind of thinking through what it would take to get to that point. Any other questions out here? I think I'm going to jump back to some slides. Any other questions before we kind of exit the demo part? Yeah, Gary.
Maybe about to cover this, but I guess I keep thinking, well, if I'm not just a power, but our organization is just a Power BI organization. Don't have, we're connecting to,
Yeah.
you know, a production server to pull data into Power BI. Now we're looking at an opportunity here with Fabric to move in the data into a better environment for more robust reporting. What do I get based on my current license? And what I guess I'm kind of sensing that there's a lot of similar skills, but I might need to know something new about this new this one lake environment, how to get data into that one lake and the interface, user interface to do all that work.
But as I said, so it kind of depends on how you're going about it. If you're doing kind of this virtual data warehouse approach where most of the work is occurring in Power Query today in your semantic model as you're building that Power BI semantic model, then the approach that I just showed you, where you can kind of really just kind of take those Power Query scripts and copy them out, those tables that you're creating in Power Query, and copy them out and create them out there in those data flows. If you're going the other route and you've got a lot of you've got an existing ETL process that loads and transforms data into a data warehouse, into a Azure SQL data warehouse or an Azure database somewhere, then you're going to have to kind of look at what you've used to create that. Again, if you've used data factory pipelines, those can easily be migrated over here and push data into the one lake instead. If you're using some kind of a third-party ETL tool, then that may be a little bit of a heavier lift. But yeah, it is a pretty good segue here into kind of what I wanted to just kind of recap here in terms of what I'm saying are kind of the architectural implications of some of the stuff we've talked about, what you do. So if you've got Power BI stuff out there right now and everything's working fine and it's a fairly small refresh and it's not taking more than 10 or 15 minutes to refresh every night, and you don't have any real complaints about the timeliness of the data, I'm not suggesting that everybody run out and re-architect this for Fabric right away. Stick with what you've got. I think slowly Microsoft's both going to kind of convert some of this stuff. As I said, I think they're probably going to move more towards the direct lake model. In fact, you reminded me, there's one other thing I wanted to show you here real quickly, because this may be another way to go about this. Come on. That's what I have this dummy little sales demo out here. But if you look at one other way kind of around this potentially is if you get into the settings of a semantic model. This is an import mode model that a real small one that I threw up here. Excuse me. But if you look at get into the settings here, one of the things you'll see is this one lake integration. And if you kind of read what that says there, if I can scroll over, do that. There you go. But what it'll do is it'll take an existing import mode model that you pushed out to a Fabric enabled, and we'll get into that, a Fabric enabled workspace. And if you click this, turn this on, then it'll take that model you've created and kind of do what we talked about a moment ago. It'll take that model, and instead of just landing it as a semantic model out in Power BI, it will actually push your files out into OneLake as Delta enabled OneLake. So it's kind of a backwards way around. Now there's a few other steps you'll need to go to kind of bring those tables then into your warehouse, but that's a possibility to kind of go around that way as a kind of a workaround. Now I haven't thought that all the way through in terms of what that would mean from an ongoing basis. But again, this might even be an easy way if you're looking to take advantage of some of the other kind of stuff I talked about a moment ago, where you have other people that want to be able to use this, so especially if you've gone that virtual route where you've got a lot of stuff done in Power Query and you want other people to be able to kind of take advantage of it, connect to it, utilize it. You could turn this on, write those files out into the Delta Lake or the one lake in the Delta format, and people will be able to connect to it through a variety of those kind of tools we talked about. Just as an aside, I think I had this open somewhere. Where did my, see, I like to keep tabs open. I think I had 170 some odd open this morning. No judgment. Why can't I get back to my desktop here? This is the Storage Explorer. Anybody ever used Azure's Storage Explorer? This is essentially just a kind of a file explorer for your Azure data lake storage containers. But if we look in the one that I'm connected to, zoom that in again, you'll see here. So we've got the that sample data warehouse is the one that we were kind of looking at. If I drill into that, you'll see the tables. We'll get down to the schema. Those are all the tables we've created. So if we look at those, these are what Delta enabled Parquet files look like. We've got a log that keeps track of kind of what's going on. It's from a SQL standpoint, you can think of that as your log file, right? That keeps track of what's been happening in there. And then these are the actual Parquet files themselves. Kind of see them. Kind of see them here. So that's what they. I mean, that's the storage engine right there. And you kind of see how it's nested and structured, et cetera. So, and then if I go back up, because there's that sales demo one that I was just kind of talking about, that's the one that I turned that. Yeah, the sales demo is the one that I just turned that option on to have it write files out here as well. So now you can see it. It's just got a single sales table or something out there right there. But the same thing, it wrote those files out here, and so now you could potentially have other tools connect to those and query that data and use that, or even update that data for that matter. So that presents its own set of interesting opportunities from an integration standpoint, even an update standpoint. So switching back to the slides, a few other, just going to keep going back to that. Okay. So as I said, if you go this route, it could remove the need altogether for your that relational, that data warehouse that may exist somewhere. So I know there are a couple of Synapse users that were in here. We'll get into the licensing here in a minute. It's taking longer than I thought. It's possible that you could get rid of a lot of your Synapse workload and convert it over here into Fabric. For larger models, I said it's a lot easier if anybody's trying to do incremental refresh. I think this is very compelling for incremental refresh users, just because incremental refresh is kind of a pain. And this could be a much easier approach to get at that current data. We mentioned the ability to query some of these from other tools. And one other thing, RLS, row level security. Anybody using row level security in some of their Power BI models? I know that's popular. Row level security is not quite there yet for these direct lake models, and I know that's a big one for some people. They have a new security layer that they're trying to put on top of. Can anybody guess what it's going to be called? One security. That's right. Yeah, one security. Yeah. Power security. One security. It was going to be good. You had a couple of choices there. One security. Yeah, and that promises really to push the, if you think about row level security right now is done within your Power BI model. They're trying to with one security, it'll push the layer down into that warehouse, or kind of that at the Delta file level really, and then it'll all flow up from there. So it's a really cool concept, because now you're not having to implement that at various other places. So theoretically, if someone was writing Python code against these files, it would respect the security that was so it's more like, from a SQL standpoint, maybe integrating the security at the SQL level, or the kind of the data access level is, and that all the tools that were built on top of that would respect that. So
reach all the way into all the inspected something.
I don't know. It's not quite there yet, and they haven't given a whole lot of details other than say this is the reason it's not there yet. But let's get into, because I'm running out of time here, the licensing part, unfortunately, because everybody loves to talk about licensing. But there are some important distinctions here. So I think one or two people said they were using Power BI Premium today. So this is licensed very much like Power BI Premium. So it's capacity based instead of capacity is kind of a hybrid between kind of your traditional software as a service licensing and more of a PaaS model. So something in between. You're renting a server that gives you so much in terms of memory and CPU, or they're what they're called capacity units. So you're getting some horsepower based on what you pay. Now, what's really appealing about this is some of these lower levels that you see up here. Because Power BI Premium has always started right there, that red level up there, where you had to pay about $5,000 a month to get started with Power BI Premium. But we've got all the way down to this, what they're calling this F2 SKU, where you can get started for as little as like $150 a month if you make a reservation. That's a year long or maybe a 3-year long reservation if you're willing to commit to that. But even the pay as you go kind of approach, if you're trying to try this out, is still very appealing. And by the way, if you want to try this out, they're still giving away the Fabric trials out there if you guys sign up for those through Power BI. Ours keep ticking down and then they keep adding time to it. So I'm not sure what the thought is there, but there's still free trials if you just want to try some stuff out. But a number of different price points there to kind of get started and kind of scale up. A lot more at the entry level than Power BI Premium gave you. The distinction there, right there at that red level, where your premium. So those of you that have a premium capacity, it basically just kind of converts over to that F64 SKU for Fabric. So if you're already paying for a premium capacity, you basically have Fabric already. It's just a matter of somebody going into the admin portal and turning it on for you, and you'll be able to do all those things we looked at. And there's really no additional cost. There is no additional cost at that point. But if you want to get started at one of those lower levels, the only distinction there between what you've always been able to do with Power BI Premium and traditionally the reason that people have gone to Premium is because they've got a lot of users and they don't want to have to pay a per user cost for all the people that they want to view. That is still true of all those F64 and down, F64 and up, depending on how you look at it. 64, 128, etc. If you license it that way, you get that capability in Power BI. If you get in on an F2 or an F4, one of these ones below an F64, you still get all of Fabric. You still get all of Power BI. The only distinction is that you still need to pay per user licenses for viewers at those levels. So it really is a compelling argument, but it's not a complete cheat code on your Power BI Premium capacity, unfortunately. So if you've got 100 users or something like that, you could pay for, and again, depending on what level you start with, like an F2, and then pay for the extra 100 users still, and it still would come in quite a bit cheaper, I think, than an F60 or a Power BI Premium alone.
And do you have any premium connector issues if you're going out to, you have a viewer and you're heading out to SQL Server or something like that?
Weird connector issues doing what?
I'm sorry, connector licensing, like premium connector licensing.
No, not that. I mean, other third parties that may charge you depending on how you access your data, but nothing else from Microsoft. No, that's what's so compelling about this. I mean, this is really you get more or less all of Fabric for that, even at that F2 price. The only distinction would be on the Power BI viewer licenses that you would still need if you want to roll out to a bigger audience. Trying to rush through. So just a couple of scenarios. So I mentioned, right? So if you've just got 50 users or so, you still could pay the even for that, maybe before you're paying for that premium per user. If anybody was familiar with that SKU, that was basically giving you all the premium, but just on a per user basis. But now you could go to that Fabric model where you could get in at that F2 for just 156. You pay for your standard pro licenses for those viewers, and you're still quite a bit cheaper to go that route as a potential option there. And then more at your enterprise level, and it's harder to put numbers around this, but Synapse, one of the benefits of this pricing model for Fabric is the consistency with which it is applied, right? So you're paying that, whether it's that $5,000 a month for that F64 or whatever layer it is, it's going to be that same $5,000 a month. Synapse got a little tricky, as I mentioned earlier, that on the data factory side, particularly when you're running pipelines, there's quite a bit of potential variability. If I'm loading data nightly, for example, if I've got, 1,000 rows that I'm processing tonight, and tomorrow night, for whatever reason, I've got 2,000 rows, I'm going to pay, in some cases twice as much to run those pipelines, just because it's a kind of a per use, per consumption basis. Whereas in this Fabric mode, you're paying for the capacity, and you can kind of use it however you'd like. Now, you're still going to have some limits on how much you can use and how that works. But that's the notion here. So it's likely going to be cheaper to go this route. It's certainly going to be more consistent. And if you're able to maybe migrate some of those workloads that you've been doing in Synapse over into this Fabric capacity, especially if you've already got a premium capacity that's now Fabric enabled, you're already paying for it. You might as well try to fit kind of as much into it as you can. And it's possible that you could eliminate a lot of your Synapse cost and kind of pull it into this environment and get some of the other benefits we talked about for Fabric as well. We're just about out of time. These are a couple of things that I kind of flagged as more kind of advanced topics. So maybe before we get into these, any other questions about anything else that we've talked about, on the pricing or the subscription stuff? Yeah.
Similar to the other data factors, one of them Databricks. I know there's Azure Databricks, and that's pretty much the same as Azure.
Yeah, so I would consider that maybe more of a complementary. But I mean, Databricks itself. Well, first of all, Databricks sits on top of Delta-enabled Parquet files. So the underpinnings there are are shared basically. There's not a Databricks per se as part of Fabric. There are a lot of other tools there that do the same kind of stuff. But yeah, it's not hard to imagine, because you can run Databricks in Azure. And you could certainly probably run a Databricks environment on top of some of the files that are already in here. So that's potentially, yeah. This bursting and smoothing just talks briefly about the ability, the way that it kind of manages resources. And I think the key takeaway here is that really the third bullet there is that because of the way that Microsoft manages the resources there, you're able to size your capacity based on its average utilization as opposed to just the peak capacity, which has always been a challenge. If you've ever been involved in procuring resources for servers, hardware, essentially, right? You got to think peak and then kind of work backwards from there. But because it's still in this shared environment, you're essentially able to kind of borrow from future periods and kind of pay it back over time. So if you've got a bunch of stuff that loads early in the morning, and then your capacity is pretty quiet the rest of the day, it'll kind of burst up for those few hours in the morning when you're running a bunch of maybe your expensive data load or ETL process, and then kind of smooth that out back during the day. But again, that's probably a bigger topic that has to do more with kind of finding the right size for your capacity, and that's probably going to be a lot of trial and error anyway. So, anything else? I really didn't think that was going to take almost all our time. I thought I'd have good 20 or so minutes here, but I droned on about a few things. So, yeah, I did. Well, yeah, I appreciate the question. Certainly, it helps kind of to get the feedback and answer your questions. So, if not, then we'll go ahead and wrap up. But be happy to take any other questions offline if you guys have. So thank you. We didn't have any other ones online, did we, Julie? I'll take that as a no.
Tables are firm. Good job.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.